talk a little bit about one of your areas of specialization that you're an expert in, which is zoonotic diseases. And obviously the COVID-19 is one in a long collection of zoonotic diseases. But could you back up and explain for those people who might not have a good understanding what a zoonotic disease is, how important they are, and yeah, just and how the COVID-19 fits into that family.
Yeah, so again, it's a hard question because you can go in many different directions. But okay, a zoonotic disease is a disease that is transmitted from animals to man, to human, let's say. So that's the classical definition. And so you have a lot of historical diseases like plague, and then you have more like unknown disease, but new emerging diseases like Lassa fever, Ebola, of course, monkeypox, which is a smallpox-like disease, and all those bat-borne diseases like SRAS and the COVID-19.
And all the influenzas too,
yeah,
right?
Sorry.
And all the influenzas are also, right?
Well, yes, they are not as simple as, but yeah, definitely they are zoonotic diseases, but a mix of different pieces of different viruses from different animals. But yes, of course, yes, they are.
Yeah, yeah. And so actually a fairly high percentage of human diseases are zoonotic in origin, right?
Yeah, more or less 70%, yeah.
70%, oh my God, so it's, yeah. And so what is your work over your career been working on these diseases, just briefly, which diseases have you specialized in and where has your research taken you?
Yeah, so I'm clearly a specialist of plague, so bubonic plague or the medieval plague, and I spent like more than 10 years in my life trapping rodents and studying their fleas and also the dynamics of transmission, but also the perception in humans, how the people relate to the disease, how they perceive the disease in different communities, which is, to me, very relevant because we tend to look at epidemics with our prism, which is like the way we see an epidemic until it touches you and hits you like the COVID-19, and then you change your perceptions, obviously. So for me, it has always been like a reality in my life that I have to tackle. Like I study diseases and I work with people who are suffering from those diseases. So they are already, I won't say they are adapted, but they have, a different vision than the very like catastrophic vision that we are now hearing and reading every day. So this is the main disease I've been working on. And I also started to work on monkeypox, which is a smallpox-like disease, also a zoonotic disease, but we don't know which is the reservoir yet. And it mostly hits DRC, the DR Congo, but it's endemic to Africa. And again, most of my research has been trying to identify the reservoir with an S of the disease. So trying to understand, okay, what are the animals that are the carriers and what are the animals, what is the relation of humans towards these animals? Do they eat them? Do they live close by? Do they get in contact with them because they encroach the forest environment where they live or because they modify the land use to make crop fields? Those kind of questions have always been central in my research.
So in a way, your research combines the scientific, lab work and tracking, and looking under microscopes with anthropological work or ethnographic work in a sense, because you're embedded in the cultures and you're trying to understand their cultural and personal and psychological relationship to the diseases as well, right? So your work is holistic in that sense.
Yeah, it's let's say interdisciplinary, yeah. But it's very important because even now it's interesting. It's also the way we have been framing the risk, right? There are many aspects that are interesting because I'm a scientist, but maybe I'm not a traditional scientist in a way that I'm not like pushing for like publishing a lot of high-level papers, which might be something that people check on your CV. I've always been a field scientist and like really be living with the people, which give me a very different viewpoint compared to people that only stay in their offices or modeling, which is part of the work, and we need that. But I've always realized how important it was and how poorly it was like valorized in scientific publication, the way people think and look at disease. We always tend to frame it the way we want them to, we want to look at it. So for example, for diseases, we always picture that as a horrible thing that will happen. And we rarely picture that as a human environment relationship that actually, if we deal with that in a positive way, we might both be winning, like in health. And that's probably the concept of One Health that has been, emerging in the last 10 years, 20 years since actually the first episode of SARS in 2000, around 2000, where clearly there was a need to try to have like a single view or try to bring disciplines together and not trying to, reinvent the wheel. Everybody has his own way, right?
So can you explain a little bit what the One Health perspective is? Is this idea that, to understand disease, one has to understand the ecosystems and human relationships to ecosystems and to animals, right? So it combines medicine, veterinary medicine, ecology, and is that right? Am I?
Yeah, exactly. It's if you want to picture in a way, it's like health for everybody and everywhere. So and everybody it means the animal health, the human, and the environment, because you cannot disconnect all of these, right? So, and this One Health approach is sometimes difficult to implement or difficult to pass on because it might seem very theoretical, but in a way, if it was also better explained by us scientists how a One Health approach can be implemented, it will also be very useful. And so we learn every day, obviously, and we learn more in the field by trying to explain that to people in the field, that everything is interconnected. And this has been really a growing field of research and discussion, like how to better integrate our forces and also the funds. Instead of, every single like the animal sector, the human sector, the environment sector, spending funds to deal with the same problem. Why not, be working together? And so that's a way actually of not spending so much funds because we bring them together to tackle the same issue. So that's also one of the reason why it's important to realize that it's not only about the health in the wild, let's say, but it's also like, okay, how do people frame it and understand it?
So, I mean, in an ideal society in which people took the concept of One Health as a guiding, principle, would you be sending in teams of people who are in developing local resources so that people could be studying the ecology while they're treating diseases, while they're helping economic development? Would it be something like that it would be a multifaceted approach to, I mean, we're far away from that, but is that the kind of thing you could envision as a...
Yeah, and it's also the kind of thing that we are getting towards, actually. There are projects that have been trying to do that and bringing people together, trying to make their work together, also like highlighting and explaining the benefit of working in that kind of interdisciplinary teams. And I can give a very good example is like when you have an epidemic, and we can even see it now, but the source is very far. But let's say when you have an epidemic, usually when you have an outbreak and it's a threatening disease, every effort and most of the funds go towards saving human lives, so acting on the consequences. But very rarely you have people that are brought in to work on the cause, which is the zoonotic source. So there is often a delay between the time when actually humanitarian help and people are being treated and medical teams are in place, and the time when biologists and people working in the environment are actually called in. So we have always a lag between the cause and the consequence, and that's also why it's sometimes very hard to understand the beginning of an epidemic, because and this is something we are also pushing forward with all the research I've been doing, but I'm not usually the only one. Many people are seeing that in many outbreaks. So it should be also we are kind of making a plea to get access to the epidemic center at the same time as the medical teams. That will be ideal.
I see. So let's back up for a minute and let's talk a little bit about previous histories of zoonotic diseases and of epidemics, because obviously human history has been characterized by many episodes of epidemics, some of them very famous, like the Black Death, and others people know less about, like Justinian's plague that actually wiped out even more of Europe's population. And then recently we've had outbreaks of SARS and Ebola. So do you see any parallels to, I mean, people talk a lot about the 1918 episode, which was the sort of the last big one that impacted the industrialized, world after World War I. But what do you see as some of the episodes in previous zoonotic pandemics that might have lessons to teach us about what's happening now with the COVID-19? I know that's a topic, it's like that.
Yeah, but it's also interesting because there were also times where, again, people were more focused on the consequences and not the causes. And sometimes even the cause were not known, like in the Justinian plague. It was too early in history to know that rats and fleas were the one, involved. So it's very interesting to see maybe the parallel is maybe the social aspect to it, or the way people react every time in history, the perception of the invisible threat. And I am not at all an expert in the 1918 flu, but I can only imagine that you have a war, and then at the same time with a visible enemy, and then you have another war declared with an invisible enemy. So it's a lot to take on for humans, just to digest and how to react to that. And clearly you have societal consequences, social, economical consequences of those crises. And again, and at that time, there were no social media, so there was not those anxiety, like messages and anxiogen. Do you say that? People are anxious, being made anxious because of so much information and which information to go through. And so that's something that probably, that didn't exist in past epidemics, or let's say in 100 years ago. So that people were just waiting for death to come to their houses, or their households. They didn't really know what was happening. They couldn't explain it. There was no treatment, and clearly today you can see those fears coming, surging also in people's mind, because it's an invisible enemy. And everybody is trying to find someone guilty. And it's not like, we need to find someone who is guilty of that. It's like, it's not possible. We cannot accept the explanation that it just happened because of, bats or, a virus jumping from an animal to human. It all started. And so it's difficult, I think, for the human brain to take up on that, or all that, because clearly we are not used not to have an explanation to everything and Google it,
Although, we do live in an age where there is much more information than there would have been, as you said, 100 years ago. So there's an irony there that people maybe are more anxious, but at the same time, there's access to more information. It's an irony, or a paradox.
Yeah, and it's a paradox, and at the same time, and I can really talk about it because I'm I receive constantly messages from people who know me and my job, and texting me, sending me emails and papers to read and opinions of I will call them self-proclaimed gurus on the internet who have found a solution, and I have to really navigate through this, and then the scientific, let's call it evidence. But of course, we know that science is evolving every day as we discover what is happening, and it's not easy. So maybe too much information is also difficult to actually deal with, and even as a scientist, make your opinion. Okay, is that a fake news? Oh, I should maybe just try to read more about it. This kind of doubts that actually come into your mind, and it's good to have doubts, but it's maybe sometimes too many when you have so much information.
Yeah, no, I understand. I have the same problem in my own life. Let's back up for a second and talk a little bit more about the role of ecological disruption in zoonotic diseases, because there's a lot of talk of the fact that because the human population is growing so much and there are incursions of humans into habitats that they didn't normally spend as much time in, that creates more opportunity, in the wet markets in Asia people have spoken about, and just this sort of disruption of ecosystems by human beings. What role does that play, and what do you think could be ameliorated or to try to, to the extent possible, prevent these situations?
Well, clearly, it's again bringing back the One Health concept, or the fact that everything is interconnected. If you disrupt one part of the system, you might cause unexpected consequences or collateral damages that you didn't know of. And a very simple image is like, if you imagine that you have a forest and you cut that forest and you transform that into crops. So what do you do with all the connection between the different biodiversity as sensu lato, like the plants, the trees, the animals living there, what you see and you don't see, because of course we have all the soil interaction. So what do you disrupt? How do you know you are not causing, troubles, and what are the consequences of those changes? And if you do that, especially in like forest, where you have a big patch of forest and you start to encroach the edges, then you increase the edge effect, whereby species appear in those edges that have never been in contact with each other, and you increase the chances, the probability of contact between species that used to be separated. And I don't speak only about humans. It can be rodents that normally live in your house or in crop field, and because you bring them closer to rodents that live in the forest, they might actually exchange pathogens or parasites. So those encroachments actually change the interaction between species and might trigger, what we call a jump in species, and for a pathogen to emerge in a host that might be suitable for that virus. Because for a virus, a host is a habitat, right? We tend to see it as a horrible enemy of ours, but a virus is just looking for a new habitat to breed and to reproduce and expand.
To colonize.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Something we should understand, having been colonialists in our past, anyway, what about the bushmeat trade in Africa? Because I know everyone's talking now about the wet markets in Southeast Asia because of the probability that that's how this began. But are some of the diseases in Africa, the zoonotic diseases, transmitted through the bushmeat trade? Has that been your experience, or?
So it's again a difficult question, but yeah, they are the people most at risk of, let's say, introducing a zoonotic disease that will be deep in the forest are probably hunters or people logging, that will be in contact with those species that were not there. But the other way around is also true. If you have disturbed so much your habitat that you have only a few remaining trees on your plot, then bats who used to roost in the forest, they will only find those roosts in your plot and they will come there. And if they are carrying disease, they can even introduce that disease in your farm. So it's not, very straightforward. But in terms of bushmeat, there is a lot of bushmeat harvesting, and clearly because the animals have been so much harvested and exploited, they are mostly smoked when they reach the cities. Many cities in Africa. Now we can see there is a trend for the wild species like monkeys or even pangolins, for that matter, to reach the markets, urban markets, smoked, because the people have to hunt them further and further. So they smoke them in the bush and then they come, and so there is less risk of transmission. But there are some instances where even in New York, there was a study where they have been screening, bushmeat illegally imported into the US in the luggage of the people. And they found some herpes viruses or simian foamy virus. Whether or not this was infectious, we don't know, because it's, DNA or RNA is not approved or infectious. It's just like you have some evidence that it was there. But still, it should, again, raise alarm bells. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think are some of the strategies that, we can, that the human species should employ to try to prevent or better manage these types of outbreaks? And do you think further outbreaks are inevitable? And would you want to venture a guess as to which of the candidates of diseases, that might be the next one? So anyway, I realize that's just speculation, but what do you think would be good strategies that we could adopt that are achievable, that might help prevent such situations or at least mitigate them?
Well, maybe it's again going back to what we know already and what is being, in some libraries worldwide, and even in museum or even in research institute. Yeah, there are so many people doing research. So we actually, scientists are really asking that right now. There are lots of papers coming out actually. Asking for more, maybe less competitive in a way that, science is competitive because people want to make discoveries, people want to publish. And so sometimes it's actually hindering the collaboration, honestly. But so there is a real call for putting together what you have already done in your lab. What do you know about those potential pandemic-able diseases? That especially in terms of sequences, DNA, RNA sequences, proteins, that will allow everybody to actually assess what is already out there that we know of and what people have been working on, to be also better prepared as scientists. We are already well prepared. There is a gene bank, there is a bank that actually gathers like a big library of all the known sequences of all living beings, right? So it's already accessible and it's public. But there are also research that are being done on those particularly dangerous diseases. And clearly not everything is published. And there might be also a reason why not to publish. It's because some, bad intentioned people might detour that and use that as to make weapons. So that's one of the reasons why not everything is public. So that's one of the things we are asking now. And in terms of preparedness, I think what we have seen is that warnings were there. There were even mock exercise of potential pandemics that had been performed in many different countries for different kind of diseases, and it seems like it hasn't been taken seriously, as in it cannot happen to us. But Ebola should have, the West African Ebola outbreak should have kind of, trigger that kind of attitude in our countries, everywhere in the world. But because it was so well contained and it hits so few people, and I have no problem to say it hits so few white people, that actually the government didn't take it seriously. It was well contained. We managed. We were we were heroes in there, and we prevented from coming to us. So why plan for a future threat? And that was the mistake, to my opinion. We need to be prepared, and everywhere in the world, I think we can see. I call it the mask war, is kind of showing that nobody was prepared.
I was thinking about it, and it reminded me a little bit of nuclear power, because nuclear power and nuclear weapons are the kind of thing where rarely, a Chernobyl or a 3 Mile Island, there'll be an accident and the consequences of that accident are terrible. Something like Chernobyl, we're still seeing the repercussions today. But because it happens infrequently, then everyone forgets about it and they don't worry about it until the next one comes. And it almost seems, in a very different sphere, obviously, of human activity, that this is the same thing, because we haven't had an outbreak as big since 1918 that was really this global, right? So that people tend, and then they cut the budgets, and they, because I remember that you were working, right, with EcoHealth Alliance, and weren't the budgets seriously cut, like, a year ago?
It was stopped.
Yeah. It was stopped, yeah. So a lot of the people who are at the forefront of exactly the kind of research that is needed in this kind of situation, those budgets had been seriously cut in the US, at least, right?
Yeah, and they are okay. So they are, it's like when you are hired for 2 years, and then you have to find a new job. Well, scientific grants is the same. So you get a grant for 5 years, you renew it, and then sometimes it doesn't get renewed. But well, the irony here is that we were working with a team in Wuhan, so we know perfectly well those people at EcoHealth Alliance. And they had been my colleagues had been publishing about coronaviruses already 5 years ago, saying that some very closely coronavirus related to SARS were circulating in China, in bats. And and recently also that some people in China were seropositive for coronaviruses, which were like all those bricks were there to show, yeah, there is a danger. It is there, and it's all published, it's been broadcasted. But I always say that people have to hit the wall to know the lesson, but they apparently need to hit it several times, and that's very, very new to me. But in terms of nuclear threats, I think, again, even though we perceive it, we now see it's a global threat because we have one atmosphere, so again, one health. People saw it as a local event, so people were not directly hit by the problem. So it remains something far away from you, and you don't relate to it. And so as long as it doesn't hit you very close, the human brain is like that. And it's true, it's a protection. You cannot be worried for everything happening in the world. But clearly, we tend to overlook and ignore those threats because they are happening far away. And when they hit you right in the face, then you start understanding actually the definition of an epidemic. That's what I've been saying since the beginning. Now people understand what it means to be quarantined, to be restricted in your movement, in your just basic freedom and human rights. And people have difficult times also to integrate that in their new life. And so, yeah, we will have a lot of lessons to take from this crisis, for sure.
Well, this one certainly is that hitting everyone enough that if there's ever going to be a lesson learned about One Health and global interconnections, this is one that should. If this doesn't do it, I don't know what is.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe just a final thought here. So what do you think, just a few of the main strategies that you think should be implemented, and what your recommendations would be in light of this? You talked a little bit about trying to coordinate the research and to use a One Health approach, but are there any other things that you think should be implemented that aren't being implemented that would be helpful? I mean, besides obviously more funding for the research, more coordination, is there anything else socially or politically?
Yeah. I think what is always missing in all, and we have been seeing it even in the projects we've been doing, is the communication, risk communication, and like people being aware of what is happening or what could happen. You can have so many things happening in your life, but people are not necessarily aware because it hasn't been communicated very well, or even during the event. There are so many different messages that people are lost. So this is a clear thing to improve, is having those communication channels like tuned on the same level, so that people understand each other and they don't contradict each other. And of course, because we are learning, it's obvious that there will be contradictory things happening, but like opinions emitted, but also there is also a tendency to try to be, the savior. Like, I'm going to save the world because I'm going to give you the good way to survive, or the best drug. And so there are something that have happened in the last 2 months that have actually prevented people from doing their job because of some people saying things. So this is also very important. I think the communication is key in also dealing with epidemic. It's not only about the science, it's not only about studying the risk factors, how it emerges, and what caused all that, but also being able to communicate about what we have been doing, so what we know already, and when it's happening, about okay, what are the best practices, and in terms of policy making as well.
And are you worried that, eventually, if and when they develop a vaccine, that we might again go into the forgetfulness? Because I know the 19 episode was sort of rapidly forgotten and buried, and that it wasn't even taught about in school when I was in school. So that they'll just think, oh, now we have the vaccine, so we can forget about this, and it'll disappear from public, discourse.
Yeah.
That's a risk, right? It's but
that's a risk, but until the next one,
Yeah.
and and that's what is scary, because great, science is helping, and we're gonna have a vaccine, but my boss is saying, we have a 1.7 million of virus out there, so you cannot develop a vaccine for every single one that will emerge. Of course, the ideal situation will be we have a vaccine for, like we call them, something like pan coronavirus or pan filovirus. So it could, prevent from all the viruses of a single family, which would be ideal. But it doesn't exist right now. And yes, having a cure, treatment, and vaccination makes the people less worried about what's coming next. And maybe the tendency to forget is quicker.
Yeah. Do you feel that there's been any advancement in terms of getting a concept like One Health or ecological medicine, an ecosystemic view of health in the medical community? Has that penetrated very much? I get the impression, you don't hear a lot from the medical community about this concept. I know at Bioneers we were pushing the idea of ecological medicine for decades, and some people get it, but it hasn't penetrated very deeply into the medical establishment, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, well, maybe establishment is the right word. In terms of human medicine is always the most noble medicine, because it touches to humans and human health, and we are the best creatures on earth. That whole kind of image of this anthropocentrism.
Yeah.
And it has been difficult to work with a doctor also, because maybe the way we have been framing it, like it's a nature biological problem and not a global, integrated health issue. And so maybe the wording is the problem. if we put it in another perspective, if we frame it like is the health of the people that is linked with the health of animals, and that's why we have to work together to prevent loss rather than to gain a few lives. You know, it's maybe a way that we frame things sometimes that doesn't attract the medical bodies. But to my experience has been that in some countries that is really well accepted, and people are really integrating that and realizing it's important. And actually, it is clear in most of the countries, human medicine, human health, especially in the south, has most of the budget, and there is virtually near to zero epidemiological surveillance of wildlife, which we have been introducing with the One Health concept. So clearly, it is something that that will take time to integrate. But the environment sector is even more difficult to integrate. And it's not because they don't want; it's because maybe sometimes they don't find their place. Maybe they don't see where they fit into that picture. So all those are new paradigms that are being like discussed and implemented. But when it is being when a One Health approach, wherever a One Health approach has been adopted, it's been beneficial.
Well, I think we can end it there, Anne, and I think thank you so much for all the work you do, being on quite literally on the front lines here in this work for that's so important. And I hope that you and your colleagues can get more funding and will be listened to in advance rather than after the epidemics begin in the future. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for doing this interview. And good luck. And I say hi to the elephants for all of us, and
Thank you.